Nice to see you all again. We are going to start today. Our topic, as you can see by the lesson, is reclining at the Seder. So today we're going to be discussing different issues related to reclining. We're going to discuss when do we recline, why do we recline at the Seder, who reclines, how do we recline. The first part of the shiur, the first chavruta, is going to be dedicated to, today we're going to do a much shorter introduction, longer chavruta time. We'll have 20 minutes today for the first chavruta. We're going to talk about when we recline, why we recline then, when maybe we don't recline, and how exactly do we recline. And then the later part is going, actually, let me just check if that's in the second part. Yeah, actually the second part is going to be when, how we recline. We'll see that there's different possibilities, and who reclines, and maybe the situation might sort of depend on who you're with, which might affect reclining. The first thing you need to know about reclining is that in those days, it was very common in the Roman time period for people to recline, as you probably know. And this, some of what we're going to learn tonight has to be viewed a little bit in the historical context, and maybe something changed. In fact, you'll see a reference to it in one of the sources that it used to be, and we'll get to this later in the course, that the 4 questions, first of all, weren't always necessarily 4, first of all, a little bit of a preview into later on. And the second thing is that the questions that we have were not all the same as the questions they had. And the question about reclining wasn't even there, because it was very common in their day for people to recline. So that wasn't looked at as something that was different than normal. The second thing I want to mention before we start is I want to pull up the Gemara for a minute. Okay, I want to remind, today we're skipping, I told you, a whole section, and we're moving to Psachim Daf Kufchet. This is your page. Okay, Kufchet Amud Aleph, that's the first side of Kufchet. And we're going to start, we underline the Gemara, the words, so you see. Now, if you notice here, there's 2 dots. Everybody see these 2 dots? So it says, Afilu ani she'b'Yisrael lo yochal ad she'yasev, and then there's another 2 dots. What exactly is that doing here? That line might sound familiar to you. Why does it sound familiar? Because that's the line that we learned when we learned the Mishnah. If you remember, that was the line in the Mishnah that said that even a poor person shouldn't eat until he reclines. And then we had a whole discussion what exactly the poor person was referring to, but in a classic way, what the Gemara does, the Gemara's job is to explain the Mishnah. Now, the focus of the Mishnah there was really talking about the poor person and reclining. But once it mentions reclining, the Gemara wants to understand, well, what about all the details about reclining? And therefore, the Gemara is going to go in depth. And the way it works, as I mentioned, we started with our first section last week, which immediately came right after the Mishnah. So there was no need to mention the Mishnah. But now, once you got many pages later, the Gemara wants you to know which line of the Mishnah are we dealing with. And that's why it's separated by 2 dots, okay, normally, or a colon, as we would say in English. In Hebrew, they call it nikudotayim, 2 dots. And the reason is it's telling you here we're quoting the Mishnah, and now we're going to start with the Gemara. So it's dealing with that line, but then again, the focus is not at all going to be on the poor person. The focus is going to be on who reclines, when, how, and in what way do we recline. Okay, 2 other things before, or a few small things. I want to go into a few of the words. One of the words we're going to see is itmar. Itmar is an introduction. Okay, Aleph Yud Taf Mem Resh. Itmar is an introduction to a debate among Amoraim, which are people who live in the time period of the Gemara. In this case, it's going to be a little bit different because it's not actually a debate about what 2 different people said. It's a debate about what one person said, and we're going to have 2 different versions of it. And then the Gemara is going to try to reconcile that issue. How do we have it that one person says he says something, and one person says he says the exact opposite? And how are we going to reconcile that? And the other thing I'm going to say is that the other term that's going to be used is below pligi. Lo pligi means they do not disagree, which is going to basically say, even though it looks like we have these 2 different traditions of what this rabbi said, in the end, they don't really disagree. And the Gemara is going to explain how they work in together. So that's going to be the first part of today's shiur, to figure out what point in the Seder do we recline, and what is this opinion, which we'll see, the 2 different opinions passed down in one particular rabbi's name, and how do they work in with each other. And interestingly, the Gemara is going to also come, which is the Gemara doesn't often do, what do we actually do today? Which again, not today, but in the time of the Gemara, based on the fact that we have these different traditions, how do we deal with it? That will be a bit of what we're doing. And okay, with that, I'm going to send everybody to chavrutas. Maggie, maybe a quick word about chavruta before we start. And before you go, I want to just say one more thing about chavrutot. So we're going to split you up into groups like we did last time. I want to remind you, Maggie had suggested last week that it's best to appoint someone in the group who's in charge of the group, who manages the chavruta. That way, if you have a number of people, if you have just 2 people, you don't really need it. But if you have a number of people, it's good to have someone manage it to make sure everybody speaks, everybody listens to everybody else's opinion. The idea is to really spend the time learning and discussing. And I want to also remind you that you do not have to get through all the questions. The idea is that I've done this multi-level, so people who happen to have a better background and can get through it quicker, great. People who it takes a longer time and you get through less, that's also okay. You're all invited to go back after the class and read more in depth and learn the material another time. It's always helpful. So if you don't get through everything, also I'll go over everything in the class. So there's no need to feel that you have to get through everything. Okay, so with that, you can get started with chavruta.